So frequently when we're doing educational sessions around research ethics at say a Primer conference or any other kind of a training, we often talk about this sense that the Belmont Report established these principles, described them, provided a framework, and then obviously those were made into regulation. So can we talk a bit about that process of going from a report like the Belmont Report and how they were operationalized or put into regulation, and what your role is in getting there?
Following the commission, as I indicated, by this time I had become the director of OPRR, the Office for Protection from Research Risks. And so we already were well aware that the 1974 regulations were deficient in many, many ways, and we were well aware that the commission reports could illuminate many of the dark corners of the regulations we had written prior to the commission's existence. And so with the approval of the director, NIH, I put together a drafting committee. And of course, by that time, Mr. Reisberg was the key. We managed to get enough pressure on the secretary to appoint him to be the legal representative of the department on the commission. And I think much of that language is his language. He listened to our staff discussions again and again and again, and then took what we said and our drafts and reworked them. And the staff was surprised over and over again at how orderly and logically he took sometimes raucous discussions about what we should do or how we should implement the thoughts of the commission and put them into legislative and regulatory language that was remarkably good, I think. We also, this is a kind of interesting point, I don't know what to make of it. We wanted to be sure that we had some handicapped people serving on that committee, and we had no one who had a very good background in bioethics, who was also severely handicapped. And so we were able to appoint Charles Krauthammer, who is now well known as a political columnist and commentator, because he's severely handicapped. We actually had to change the place where we met because he needs wheelchair access, and so we moved it over to the Westwood building, where there was an easy door to open, and it opened onto an elevator that took him to the conference room. And so that's where we held our meetings. What I find interesting is that we met once a month, twice a month for 2 years, drafting the subpart A of the regulations, and he never once made a suggestion. And here is a person who's on the news almost every day with comments on nearly every public event, and he was a silent member of our commission. He approved the drafts as they went along and signed off on them, but he contributed virtually nothing. And he has a degree in psychology, so we thought he would be a very valuable member and actually represent that lack of behavioral issues that the commission had left. And he offered us nothing.
So if he tended to be a more quiet member of this working group?
He never missed a meeting.
Who were some of the more vocal people involved in this process?
A lot of my staff. Charles McKay had a degree in philosophy. Charles had attended not all but most of the commission meetings. He had read all the reports and reflected on them carefully. He made a big contribution to the rules. We had a lawyer on my staff named Bill Dommel, who worked well with Reisberg. And Bill often did first drafts that Reisberg then improved a little. But Bill made lots of suggestions, and himself had attended many meetings of the commission and read the works. I'm blocking on her first name, but Applegate from the Mental Health Administration was, I've forgotten her title, but she was third or fourth in line in the Mental Health Administration. And she was very helpful and very cooperative, always came prepared and always with some fresh thoughts, and was particularly sensitive to the needs of those who were involved in research involving the mentally handicapped or disabled. And she contributed mightily there. Trying to think who else. Carol Wigglesworth had come to my office. I don't know if she even had a college degree. She came as a secretary, and she wasn't there very long when we realized this lady is brilliant. She's, I think, grade 3 secretary, which is about as low as you can get in the federal scale. It became clear that she was taking dictation and typing documents from members of the staff, and her versions of what they had dictated to her were far better than anything they gave her.
Wow.
And so I remember talking to personnel saying, I want you to promote her as fast as the federal government will allow. And she served as the working secretary of that group. And I cannot tell you which passages are her work, but she managed to take very disorderly discussions and turn them into orderly reports. So, Carol, I think the least educated maybe made the greatest contribution of all. And she also drafted later the regulations for the care and use of laboratory animals and did a magnificent job with that. She was just a diamond in the rough with very little education that would have suggested any talent in this field, and she rose to the top as fast as she could go. So she was influential.
Now, with the writing of Subpart A, do you recall if there were certain components or passages within Subpart A that proved very difficult to sort out or to write?
We must have spent 8 or more meetings dealing with minimal risk, because the commission had come up with the notion that you need to pay a whole lot more attention to significant risk research than to minimal risk research. They felt that, yes, harm could be done in minimal risk research, but it was not likely either to be major invasions of the rights of subjects or not likely, and the subjects were likely to understand what they got into so that they didn't need as much protection. And also simply because subjects are not likely to understand all of the risks that are involved if it's very complex, high-risk research, and might not fully protect themselves unless the consent documents and the consent process was very strong. So then we decided, well, how do we cut these? How do we create a kind of two layers of research? And I think we must have argued for days, if not weeks, about minimal risk. And I think IRBs, with our rather vague definition, still struggle with what is minimal risk. And I think it's the nature of the beast. I don't think anyone is ever going to define it much better than we have already done. And that's not to say it's a good definition, but I don't think anybody's been able to improve on it.
It seems like many have tried and failed to write a better definition. So it's obviously a difficult challenge.
So yes, that was a big problem for us. It was also it's much of what we left out of the regulations, I think, should have been left out. We had long passages borrowed or adapted from Robert's rules and other places about how the IRBs were to function. And we finally, we tested some of these things in the IRB over at Johns Hopkins. We wanted to take it outside of NIH because that's a kind of rarefied and not a typical IRB. So we took it to Hopkins, and there we actually violated the Administrative Procedures Act, which forbids showing drafts of regulations to anyone unless you show them to everyone. They're supposed to be secret. And we thought, this just doesn't make sense if we don't test these things out. And so I had attended a number of their IRB meetings just for my own education. Got to know the chairperson over there, whose name I've now forgotten, but who had been chair for a long time. And they quietly tested the regulations as we drafted them for all their meetings, well over a year.
Really?
And they made lots of suggestions for changes.
Do you remember any of those that stand out?
Well, I think particularly in the assessment of risk, in those sections where some segments of research, some segments of consent can be waived under certain circumstances, safeguards for those who are mentally incompetent, and just different wording of some of the things that have survived, but they found the wording too complex, or they would argue about what the regulation meant, and that told us we'd better clarify it. So they were most cooperative, and I burned a lot of rubber going over to Hopkins up in Baltimore during those years. And I was always very nervous because it was in strict violation of the law. But I felt there is a higher law. If these regulations are to be in any way effective, we have to test them. And we have to have someone other than federal employees test them. And so we used that process, and we kept that a very even on my own staff, only a few of us knew that we did that.
Really?
We came back to meetings with suggestions for changes in the draft, and we never told them where they came from. Many of them came from Hopkins.
Wow.
And if I were in the government again, I think I would do the same thing again.
That's
So-
a really neat story. I had not heard that one before.
Well, we never advertised it
All right.
because we didn't want somebody to challenge the regulations on the grounds that they were created in violation of the Federal Procedures, Administrative Procedures Act.
Right. As you were making these refinements and nearing what would end up being publication of the rule, of course, there's at the national level, political change is underway. You're nearing
Yes.
the end of President Carter's term as president. Can you talk a bit about the lead up to publishing the regulation and how the politics at the national level influenced that process, if it did at all?
It did in some dramatic ways. First, let me just go back for a moment and say another unmentioned, unsung member of our that contributed to this was, again, Dr. Leroy Walters. By this time, he and I had become very close friends. I was with him when his wife died on the operating table at Georgetown University. My wife and I spent lots of time with their children and so on. So we were like one family. I think we had at least 2 meals a week with the Walters family. So they were just an extension of our own family. But he was also, in my judgment, as good as any ethicist in America. So I think probably a week never passed without my calling to get his opinion about something we were going to put in the regulations. So he was not on and didn't have time to serve on our drafting committee, but he certainly played a major role and gave me many evenings on the telephone answering questions or suggesting ways to word something and so on. So I don't want to leave him out of that process. And he will come into some later developments that I want to tell you about. But one of the things that happened when Jimmy Carter began to fall out of favor, it looked as if he was going to lose the election. And it looked as if Ronald Reagan was going to take over. And Reagan had said again and again in different speeches, I think he didn't mean it quite at the level of hyperbole that he stated in his speeches, but he said, if I am elected, I will do away with all federal regulations. Now, of course, I think nobody took that as literally true, but it was very clear that he felt the country was overregulated, and he was going to do a great deal, everything in his power, to deregulate industry, finance, all kinds of things that safety in paint and all. He had dozens of examples. And when he was actually elected in November of 1979 was the election. No, 80 was the election. The transition team visited us, the Reagan transition team. We told them we had been working on these regulations for several years, and they said, Ronald Reagan will never, at least in the first year he's president, if he wins, he will never approve regulations after all the speeches he's given, disapproving any kind of federal regulation. So you had better get them published before Carter goes out of office, or they will never be published. So we began to work very hard, and then they gave us some clues. They said Reagan might tolerate them, or at least not veto them, if he sees them as deregulation. So we had emergency meetings about how we could get this all done before he took the oath of office. And that's where the minor risk regulations that could be reviewed by a single person came into existence. That was a new idea, not suggested by the commission and not even suggested by my committee. And I think we began to see it as a problem in that Hopkins said, we're spending an awful lot of time in full committee reviewing low-risk research, and that's not a good use of professional time. So between the Reagan folks telling us we had to advertise these as deregulation, and the Hopkins people telling us that we have to have an expedited procedure for low-risk studies, we invented in 1 month the whole creation of expedited review. And that's the least well-drafted section of the regulations. Riceburg worked night and day to write them, but they never got reviewed as well as all the other parts of the regulations. So that was just a little aside of how politics was affecting, and I think, despite the fact that I would rewrite some of the sections on expedited review, I think the concept is exactly right. That it would have been a terrible burden on whole committees to review low-risk research that could easily be approved by one experienced reviewer. But in order to do that, I think we produced that section in less than 2 weeks. Then we took them down to the secretary's office, and they had been kept abreast under Carter, and they had been kept abreast of all of this. But it was about that time that Carter fired Joe Califano, and I'll come back to that because he was following this very closely. Now we had Patricia Harris as the new secretary, who couldn't care less about human subjects research or getting the rules through. And so we had to work very hard on her staff to say, we've got to get these done before Ronald Reagan comes to office or they'll never be done. And she said, in effect, I don't care whether they get published or not. And so we persuaded staff to lean on her, and she finally said yes, she would sign them. And we worked the last 3 nights. I think I went close to 48 hours without any sleep, getting a final draft ready for her to sign. Took it down, and at her farewell party, she put down her champagne glass and signed the regulations the day before she went out of office, and Reagan came in. So we missed the deadline, or came ahead of the deadline by about 12 hours. And she was clearly annoyed that we had invaded her little farewell party, partly because it's in the department, it's against the rules to serve alcohol, and this was a champagne party and in violation of all the rules, and she had only invited people she could trust. And I invaded that party, and she was furious at me, but she did sign the rules, and so they were published after Reagan actually came into office, but they had been signed before he came into office. So I think it was January 19th that she signed the regulations, and he came into office on January 20th. At least that's the way I remember it.
Right.
But I do know it was a close deadline. And then my office went out and had a big drunken party to celebrate the completion of the regulations.
You must have felt like a tremendous sort of weight was lifted
We did.
when the secretary signed that.
We did.
Yeah.
We thought it was a great triumph. And we were so discouraged in the end. And that's why, by the way, I think the section on expedited review is poorly written. Mm-hmm. And that's the part I would change, not to do away with it, but to make it clearer what the obligations and the training should be for reviewers who conduct expedited review.
And then last question before we back up and talk about the Ethics Advisory Board, but how long did the euphoria last of having the regulations done and signed before you had to turn your focus to the realities of implementing them?
Well, it was a more gradual or transition than you might think, because we were operating under 1974 regulations.
Right.
So we already had IRBs.
Right.
We had to notify the institutions, but most of them welcomed them, partly because of the role of primer. We haven't discussed that much, but at every stage, I must have given 3 or 4 talks at every primer meeting during those years of development of the commission and the drafting. So people from the major institutions had been coming. Primer's attendance went from, I think, around 50 people in 1977 to 200 or 300 by 1980, maybe 400. Mm-hmm. Joan could fill you in on those statistics. Sure. But virtually every major institution had been following, and I had been reporting on the drafting, again in general terms so I wouldn't publicly violate the Administrative Procedures Act. But it wasn't a big shock to the research community. They had known something of the commission. They were, through primer and other means, they were well aware of Belmont. They knew the kinds of things we were struggling with. And they found most of the changes reasonable and improvements not, so they were not hostile. Mm-hmm. As a rule. There were obviously a few exceptions, but the research community welcomed this. And so I think in January of that year, we started writing new assurance documents. And maybe a little aside about assurances, where they came from, might help. Before there were any regulations, it was Dr. Stone, I think, back in about 1972 or so, who created the office that had responsibility for protecting subjects. Don Chalkley was the person who was head of that office, and it was an office over in the Division of Research Grants, which now has a new name. I don't know what the new name is. But his office was called DRG, and their job prior to getting into ethics was to negotiate problems that had not been foreseen in grants and contracts. So, for instance, if an investigator got a grant and a lot of equipment, new X-ray machines or the like, and then transferred to a different institution, the question of what happens to that equipment had to be negotiated. Does it stay in the institution or does it move with the investigator? And so his office of 4 people went to universities all around the country and negotiated these issues that fell outside the granting mechanism. And when they reached an accommodation and an understanding. They signed a document. They didn't want to call it a contract because the legal people had said these are not technically contracts, so they called them assurances. And that's where the notion of an assurance negotiated by NIH people or HHS people with the institution. That's where that name came from, and that process developed. So it had been in existence for a long time. So it was just a shift over to include medical research involving human subjects. So that's where that came from. And we had 4 people who spent all their time negotiating assurances.
Really?
And we had assurances long before the new regulations were in existence. So all they had to do was renegotiate existing assurances. And that was far easier than a kind of starting from scratch. Because we already knew the people in the institution who would end up signing them. We had already dealt with them on other issues in most cases. So it wasn't as hard as it sounded to initiate the new rules. And that's not to say we didn't have problems, and it took, the whole process took about 4 years. And the most resistant institution in America was the hospital at NIH. They had developed their own procedures independently of the rest of the nation. They did not want to change. They rejected the new regulations. And it was not until I threatened, first of all, they had an accident over there where a research subject died in a study, unexpectedly, in a study that was not thought to be risky. And apparently she had a heart condition that nobody knew about, and maybe somebody should have checked, but in any case, she died. And it was not until she died and I went to the director of the clinical center and said, unless I have a signed assurance in my office by tomorrow, I am going to the press and say, you are the only institution in the country that's out of compliance with the new regulations. And I had the assurance on my desk the next day. So that was one incident that where a death actually contributed to our bringing NIH itself into compliance. And they had always felt they were above the regulations, which was a strange, so here I am working in the building right next to the NIH Clinical Center where all the research was going on, and able to negotiate with institutions in every part of the country except the one next door. And that finally worked out, but we had to really get brass knuckles out to make that happen. And we later became very good friends. We taught them how to do research under the new regulations. They finally came around to saying this is better. But it was not an easy process.
So as the regulations were being drafted and put into place, I mean, that was obviously a big job with a lot of implications for how future research was going to be conducted, but it wasn't the only activity you were involved with at that time. So, you know, and of course the National Commission did not get the extension that they thought they might for another year. Following the National Commission, Secretary Califano establishes the Secretary's Ethics Advisory Board, and you had a central role in that as its executive secretary.
I did. A little background on that. Not many people know it, but prior to my going to work for the government, I had been in the priesthood. And Califano actually made his reputation over in Department of Defense as one of Secretary McNamara's whiz kids. He was surrounded by a number of very bright, aggressive people. And I had met Califano at a cocktail party in Washington. And I think he was struggling with ethical problems at the time relating to the Vietnam War, because he was part of...
He was still in the Department of Defense.
Yes. Anyway, to make a long story short, I became his confessor. So Califano and I had a very special kind of relationship. Some years later, I left the priesthood. Some years later, he supported Jimmy Carter and was named secretary of now HHS. And he had lost track of me, I had lost track of him, but we met in the corridor one day and kind of renewed our friendship. So when the National Commission was winding down, he still had lots of problems he wanted discussed. And he created his own ethics advisory board. And so since he already knew me, he appointed me to be the staff director, and probably knew that I had something to do with the National Commission as well. So that Secretary's board was also very proactive, and we looked into things that have come up much more prominently at later times. For instance, we did a study on nosocomial infections, hospital-induced infections, and ways to stop them. And one of the things we recommended was that every hospital in the country publish the number of infections that were that came to be because of patients in the hospital. We thought that the remedies or prevention of these infections was already well known. Better sanitation, better washing of hands, better use of gloves, all the things that the profession needs to do. And we thought the way to get hospitals to do these things was simply to publish annually the number of nosocomial infections, hospital-induced infections, that they had each year. And we tried it on a couple volunteer hospitals, and the number of infections dropped dramatically. As soon as the administration felt it would embarrass them, they found that they really could lean on staff and get them to follow all the procedures that were already well known. So we published a report on nosocomial infections. It was set aside because it was an election year, and nobody wanted to offend the heads of hospitals in major cities where Carter needed the votes. So that was one of the things we did, and it was a very thorough study. That was the year Baby Faye, was it? No, it wasn't Baby, the English baby was born. Yes, it was Baby Faye. And so it raised all kinds of questions about the ethics, and Califano got very interested in it. So he asked his commission, or his committee, to look into it. And so I actually flew over to England and interviewed Steptoe and Edwards and found some interesting things. One, the fertilized embryo was actually done in a laboratory that was far away from the mother who actually bore the child. And they transported the fertilized ovum in a rabbit. They put it in a rabbit's uterus and took the rabbit to the hospital where the lady was. And that, so instead of her coming to a laboratory that was not equipped for to deal with a pregnancy, they took the rabbit to the hospital where she was. Then they extracted the fertilized ovum and implanted it in her uterus instead. I don't think that ever was publicized. And it was interesting. The other thing we found, I asked, Edwards was not very forthcoming. He wouldn't tell us much about the whole process. And he was the scientist who really had perfected it was not a new system. It had been used in agriculture, but he found a way to do this in humans. But we asked, had any committee reviewed this? When they got grants in England from the NIH, they did create IRBs, but most of the British research was not reviewed. So when I asked Patrick Steptoe, was this reviewed prior to your doing it? He said, oh yes, and it was fully approved. And then I asked if I could see the minutes of the meeting, and indeed I got the minutes. And of course the committee was chaired by Patrick Steptoe, and the committee was made up of his own staff. So it was the approval, the so-called IRB approval, which the British medical journals had spoken of. When we found out who was on that committee, we realized it was a sham. So those were some of the things that were kind of interesting. We reported back because of matters we already talked about. The U.S. never got involved in funding in vitro fertilization or embryo transfer. But we did do a study in that committee for the secretary that is 1,200 pages long. And it took into account all kinds of legal questions. What happens to preserved embryos that are frozen and the like? We addressed all of those kinds of questions that came up in later years. Much of the report, surprise, surprise, was written by Leroy Walters, whose research was impeccable. That report is still over in the Kennedy Institute Medical Library. It's almost never cited by anybody, and it addressed nearly all the questions that came up over the next 10 years, including many of the legal questions about what is the role of the person who is the surrogate mother who carries the child, but neither the ovum nor the sperm came from her family.
Right.
And those kinds of questions are all addressed in there. And so it was about 10 years ahead of its time. And I think it's still maybe the best document ever produced out of our office, even though it never got much credit and has largely fallen into desuetude, I guess.
Right.
But it was largely written by Dr. Walters, who worked slavishly to produce it. And again, the bonds between our office and Dr. Walters were tightened, and the respect that everybody in my office has for him was just almost, he was just almost regarded as a saintly figure because he donated most of his time. We didn't have money to pay him much for the work he did.
So in addition to Leroy Walters and yourself, who were some of the other people who were really invested in the work of the Ethics Advisory Board?
Well, I don't remember all the names anymore, but we had a lawyer from the West Coast who had also worked in the White House. He had worked in the White House with Califano and others under Jimmy Carter. They were brought up from Defense Department. And he was a very good chairman. It made for hard work for me because he dealt with me at the end of his day, and he was in California, so his day ended 3 hours after our. So I sort of took a little rest after I got home from work in the evening, and then he would call me at 10 o'clock and discuss everything we had done in the board or everything we had drafted, often till 1 or 2 in the morning. He was a very hands-on chairman. Jim Gaither was his name, and he was easy to work with. He was very smart. He respected the medical community, and he was a close friend of Califano's. In fact, Califano had made his career, so he was grateful to Califano at the time. So there was a kind of triumvirate we had. Califano liked me, he liked this lawyer, and so we all worked hand in hand. I'm blocking on the name of a lawyer from the University of New York and Buffalo, but he also contributed mightily to those studies, and he was particularly good on the legal issues associated with embryo fertilization and transplant. So those were some of the issues that we dealt with.
In addition to the issues related to the test tube babies, did the Ethics Advisory Board examine issues related to the injuries for research subjects?
We began a study of that. We ended when, very suddenly, when Califano, who was also a great favorite of Jimmy Carter, Califano had initiated a campaign against smoking. And so in the middle of the presidential campaign, he gave a series of talks in North Carolina, South Carolina, against smoking and how we should do away with our tobacco fields and grow other kinds of crops. And of course, those two states were the backbone of Carter's candidacy. He expected to carry them by very large amounts, and he drew from lots of speakers, lots of support, and lots of money. And so Ham Jordan, who was the president's senior advisor, I've forgotten the title of the person who always deals with the press. But that was his job. He dealt with the press every day. And so Ham Jordan begged Califano not to give those talks, at least not until after the election. Califano had said he had committed himself to giving the talks and was determined to do that, and he would stop only if Carter himself called him. Carter called him and fired him. Oh. And that ended the ethics board in mid-air. Patricia Harris now knew this board was tied to Califano. Califano was out of favor with the president and the White House. The ethics board never had another meeting, and Califano left. It was so complete that I went down to Califano's office 2 days after he was fired. All the pictures were changed. The furniture had been removed. His secretary had been transferred. There was no one in the secretary's office who had ever worked with Joe Califano. It was the most dramatic. I had the feeling it was Russia, and they had had a coup because it was just, and no one was allowed. They could quote Califano, but they had to quote him as the former secretary. They never could use his name again. And he just passed away as if he'd never been secretary, and he had served almost 4 years. So that was a kind of interesting aside that I learned about politics. Califano had offended a lot of people, and when he lost favor with the president, they just pretended that and tried to create a situation as if he had never had held the office.
And of course, you, as you said, you knew him from actually your pre-government days.
Yes.
Did you have contact with him beyond that?
Well, only when his ethics board reported to him. Then I reported to him, and I thought it was politically sound. So I always asked the director, NIH, to go with me, so that I didn't appear to be going around or above or outside the chain of command in NIH.
Right.
That was, you don't have to be a federal employee very long to learn those are things you shouldn't do.
Right.
And Califano had a hot temper, and he used a lot of coarse language, I would say foul language. Mm-hmm. And I remember being in the meeting room with Fredrickson, waiting for Califano to come so we could report to him on the test tube baby. And he walked in, and as he was coming in, he was chewing out a staff member using some very colorful language.
Yeah.
And he saw me, and he suddenly suddenly his voice dropped, he became very reasonable, the profanity disappeared, and Fredrickson said, "What did you do to him?" And of course, what I did to him was simply remind him that I had been his confessor for a long time, and he wasn't behaving very well. Mm-hmm. So it was a very funny situation where he looked at me and he was very uncomfortable for a while, but things relaxed and we got along all right. But those are just funny incidents you remember. I think the other thing I would like to talk to you about during that period was the whole DNA controversy arose. And so the Secretary's Ethics Advisory Board dealt with DNA, and at the time, there were a lot of scientists as well as other people who felt that any kind of alteration in DNA of plants, animals, any living creatures was likely to be dangerous, create monsters, create diseases that we couldn't control, and the like. And Congress was actually considering passing laws that would have made it illegal to do research with DNA. Fredrickson was clearly opposed to any such regulation. He thought this was a great opportunity for NIH to learn about DNA. Of course, we had not yet mapped or sequenced the human genome, but people were already talking about doing that. Scientists were considering it. They were trying to discern what the significance was of these new findings of the double helix and how this could affect medicine, how it could affect agriculture, how it could and so the Ethics Advisory Board was beginning to look at that. And once again, we called in Dr. Walters, who was the first ethicist in America to write a book on recombinant DNA, and became the kind of ethics expert in America on the topic. And I think he has 4, maybe 5 volumes of work, all of them done in conjunction with scientists. So that was that relationship that I had with Leroy paid off for the government in hundreds of ways. He never asked, he was always available for consultation, never asked for any fees. And yet I think he had an enormous effect on the government. Mm-hmm. The other thing he did, there was a climate in NIH when I first came there that was opposed to ethics. In fact, Fredrickson himself was a part of that. When I first came, I think in the first month I was there, several doctors said, the ethicists tend always to remain silent until we've done our research, and then they tell us we have violated all kinds of people's rights. And so since Leroy had just come to Georgetown about the time I came to NIH, we talked about this, and we agreed there was some truth in that ethicists were very rarely involved in the planning of research. And so after the research was done, they often said, you violated the rights of subjects. And so they were very unpopular with. Mm-hmm. So we talked about how to do this, and we created seminars at NIH. And so every month I would find a scientist who would talk about something new in science that was going on at NIH, and Leroy would produce an ethicist to comment on the science. And for the first seminar we had, 2 people showed up. For the last one, 485 people, all scientists, showed up to hear these talks on ethics. And Leroy always introduced the topics, always found most of the speakers. I found some of them. Mm-hmm. Charles McKay found some of them. And we changed the whole climate of NIH. And a lot of the ideas came from Primer, mm-hmm. And from conversations with Bob Levine. And other kinds of programs that Primer had conducted, and we would take these back, modify them a little, and put them on as ethics seminars at NIH. So we did that for 8 years, and finally they outgrew our largest auditorium, and we felt that we had made the point. But just to illustrate how serious that was, Fredrickson had been the director of the Heart Institute before he was named the head of NIH itself. And his work was renowned to the point where they thought he was going to win a Nobel Prize. He never did for his work in cardiac issues. But when he was appointed director NIH, I was one of several offices that were sub-offices within the large office of the director. And he called each office director in, and I was the last one he called to his office. And he said, I think you are noted for your interest in biomedical ethics, and I want you to understand that I think it is a restraining dead hand on the advancement of science. I cannot, by law, close your office, but I can cut your budget. And so I am informing you that no one in your office will be authorized to travel. You can hire no new personnel, and your budgets must be approved by my office before you can take any steps. I was just devastated. here we were just coming off the National Commission,
Right.
all excited. Fredrickson coming on board saying, I'm going to kill all this stuff. So, of course, I got on the phone with Leroy Walters because we were such close friends and we worked hand in hand on so many issues. Leroy said, you know, we have just hired Tris Engelhardt, who's another well-known ethicist. I think he's down in Texas now. And he is coming, and in order to celebrate his entrance here, a celebrated scholar, we're going to have a celebration and speeches given at the university. And I will talk to now, in the meantime, Yale was trying to hire Walters away from Georgetown.
Oh.
And Georgetown was matching each offer. Yale would up the ante, and then Georgetown would meet and exceed the Yale offer, and so on. And it was a little like star baseball players ending up with the Boston Red Sox or some other championship team. So Leroy was meeting often with the president, and the president was willing to cooperate with him in anything he wanted to do. So Leroy suggested to the president of Georgetown that he invite Dr. Fredrickson to welcome the new ethics professor and give the talk. And Fredrickson had only been in office a month or two. His speeches were largely written by Storm Whaley, and there's another big story about him. He came to Washington in connection with a senator who was not reelected, and so he moved over to NIH. But he had been an ethics prof at the University of Arkansas. So, and he was the public affairs officer who wrote all the speeches. So I worked it out with Storm Whaley that the president of Georgetown would invite Fredrickson to give a talk. Fredrickson, and the talk would be written by Storm Whaley with some assistance from me and from Leroy. And we wrote into that talk all the things we wanted Fredrickson to say. Now, the reason we were able to do all that was because Fredrickson's senior administrative assistant was a lady named Belle Seha. And Belle lived in a neighborhood right near me. She worked long hours. She was at work at 6 in the morning and often didn't go home till 8 at night. But she was frightened to death of driving in snow. And since I lived near her, and I had at that time a four-wheel drive Jeep, when snow was predicted, she would call me, and I would get up very early in the morning and get her to work often through snowbanks and icy roads. And so we became very close friends. And Bill said, if I can ever help you, just ask, because you do lots of favors for me. Of course, it never hurts to be friendly with the staff of the boss.
That's right.
So I told Bill, when the request comes from Georgetown for Fredrickson to speak, send it over to Storm Whaley and I had already talked to Storm, and we wrote the speech. Bill managed to keep it from him until the very day that he was to deliver it. So he only read the speech an hour or so before he left for the convocation. And here was the speech saying that it was congratulating Georgetown on advancing bioethics, creating the Kennedy Institute, the great influence that Ted Kennedy had had on bioethics, how it was the new emerging field, and how NIH was going to be a major leader in the field of bioethics. And that had already been started under Califano, and we put all that stuff in the speech. And Frederickson didn't know what to do except to deliver it. And it transformed him. Then we got the president to write him, president of the university, to write him and say that was a magnificent speech. And then Storm Whaley, the public affairs officer, published a newspaper called the NIH Record, and it was published once a week. And every week for a year, he quoted something from that speech, attributing it to Frederickson. And then we would make sure that somebody wrote to Frederickson saying, "We're glad you're so enlightened in supporting the field of bioethics." And pretty soon I was on Frederickson's advisory staff. My budgets rose dramatically. He never again talked about curbing our office or doing away with our budgets. And so that's how we managed to survive in a kind of hostile atmosphere. And again, it was largely Dr. Leroy Walters who thought up these things, did them, and never got credit for any of it. But his influence in Washington was more than most full-time federal employees. Those were exciting. You were talking to me earlier about how when you're trying new things and doing new things, it's often after the fact that you can really enjoy what you accomplished. In the process, it's sometimes very trying, nervous. I wasn't sleeping well, I wasn't eating well, I was working long hours. But the results were so gratifying. Now when I look back on it, I've forgotten all the difficulties and just enjoy the fact that we were able to overcome most of those difficulties and make the job work. Whether somebody else could have done it better, I wouldn't question that. But I happened to be there and felt it was my job to do these things, and so I don't consider it unethical to sometimes go outside of the usual channels in order to get the work done that supports bioethics. And I've often wondered about the ethics of doing some of the things we did in order for bioethics to become central and ingrained in the work at NIH, where now it's just taken as a given. But anyway,
that's great. Yeah.
But those were there were people who were very hostile, and many of the investigators at the time saw no ethical difference between treating patients and treating research subjects. And consequently, they saw no need for getting consent or for getting approval from anyone. They felt they were practicing medicine, and we felt they were practicing research. And finally, we talked to Bob Gordon, who was the head of the clinical center, and we spent a lot of time with him, and he changed. He had been part of that critical group, and he changed. And finally, he said, "I think what you're telling me is that a doctor is doing this for his patient. A researcher is asking a subject to do this for him." And he said, "That's a world of difference." And I thought it was about as good a way of describing the difference between the relationship of a physician to his patients and the relationship of an investigator to his or her subjects. And so he became a great supporter. And actually, at the 11th hour that same week we were having all the trouble with the regulations, he came to me, and he is the one who wrote just those couple of lines about you may create a special committee in certain circumstances, which we now call a DSMB. It doesn't, I think the words are not used in the reg. We added those, I think, a day or two before they were promulgated. And as I look back, I think it was fortunate. We would have written regulations governing DSMBs. And in fact, they've grown up like Topsy, where different institutions do it in different ways. The Cancer Institute doesn't do it the same way as the Heart Institute. And I think it's become a very flexible instrument that is actually more effective because it's not well regulated.